The night was unnaturally quiet. The family drove through a fog that seemed to creep thicker with every mile. The father, who sat behind the wheel, squinted through the mist as if the car's headlights weren't strong enough to pierce through the darkness. The countryside road stretched on endlessly, surrounded by tall trees that swayed in the gentle breeze, their silhouettes barely visible. They had been driving for hours, and everyone was tired. The mother, sitting in the passenger seat, nervously checked the map again. "Are you sure we're on the right road?" she asked, her voice betraying the unease she tried to hide. The father nodded, though he didn't seem entirely sure himself. The kids, Tom, the teenage son, and Lily, his younger sister, sat in the back, staring out the window, the novelty of the trip long gone. They had taken a wrong turn somewhere after deciding to take the scenic route back home, thinking it would be faster. But now, it seemed like they were lost in a maze of endless roads with no signs of life anywhere. Suddenly, the car jerked forward, and the engine sputtered, letting out a sickening cough. The father cursed under his breath and pulled the car to the side of the road. "It's dead," he muttered, banging the steering wheel in frustration. The lights flickered before shutting off completely, leaving them in complete darkness. "Great," Tom said sarcastically, looking out into the void. "Now what?" The father stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting him instantly. He popped the hood and peered into the engine, but it was too dark to see anything. "I'll try to fix it," he said, though there was little hope in his voice. The mother pulled out her phone, but as expected, no signal. The thick fog seemed to swallow up everything around them, even their voices. Minutes passed, and with each one, the tension grew. The father fiddled with the engine, but nothing seemed to work. The silence on the road was deafening, interrupted only by occasional creaks from the trees swaying in the wind. Then, without warning, a soft hum filled the air. It was distant at first, but quickly grew louder, cutting through the silence like a knife. The family looked up, startled. Out of the mist, two dim headlights appeared, slowly growing brighter as they approached. It was a bus, old and worn, moving toward them with an unsettling slowness. The bus rolled closer, its tires crunching against the gravel, though there was something strange about the sound, too quiet, almost muffled, like the road wasn't entirely real. The headlights flickered weakly, casting a ghostly glow across the fog-shrouded road. The bus itself looked ancient, its faded paint peeling away, revealing the rust beneath. The windows were dark, hiding whatever, or whoever was inside. It stopped right in front of their car with a soft hiss, and for a moment, everything was silent again. The family stared at the bus, unsure of what to do. The door creaked open with an eerie slowness, but no one stepped out. "I guess we should ask for help," the father said hesitantly, though he didn't sound too confident. The idea of boarding this strange bus didn't sit well with him, but they didn't seem to have any other option. The mother nodded, though her eyes never left the open door. There was something unsettling about it, like an invitation they should refuse but couldn't. The father approached the bus first, stepping cautiously into the dim light. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing inside the empty interior. A shadow moved within, and then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a bus driver, wearing an old, tattered uniform that looked like it hadn't been worn in decades. His cap was pulled low over his face, casting a deep shadow, but something about his presence felt wrong, like he didn't fully belong in this world. Without a word, the driver gestured for them to board, his hand moving slowly, almost mechanically. The father hesitated, but then motioned for the rest of the family to follow. "Come on, let's just get to town," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. One by one, they stepped onto the bus. The inside was just as worn as the outside. Dust-covered seats, flickering lights, and a faint smell of dampness. The windows were fogged over, hiding the outside world, making it feel as though they had entered a different realm altogether. As they took their seats, the bus jolted to life with a low growl, and the door creaked shut behind them. The driver still hadn't spoken a word, his eyes, or at least where his eyes should be, locked on the road ahead. The bus began to move, slowly at first, then faster, gliding through the fog as if it knew the way even though no one had given any direction. The family sat in uneasy silence. Lily, the youngest, clung to her mother's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered, her wide eyes darting around the empty seats. Tom nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on the shadowy figures at the far end of the bus. He couldn't quite make out who they were, but something about them didn't seem right. "Just stay calm," the mother said softly, though her voice was strained. She glanced at the driver again. There was something off about him. His movements were too stiff, too unnatural, and his face, it was still hidden by the cap, but the way the light hit it, it seemed more like a shadow, like there wasn't anything there at all. The bus picked up speed, hurtling through the foggy night with growing urgency, and with every passing moment the air inside grew colder. As the bus rattled down the dark, fog-filled road, the eerie silence inside became suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint creak of the old seats as the bus sped up. The family sat in uneasy stillness, eyes shifting nervously to the other passengers at the back of the bus. They were little more than silhouettes, sitting unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. Tom squinted, trying to make out their faces, but the shadows seemed to swallow them up. "Mom," he whispered, leaning closer, "something's not right about those people." His voice trembled, the words barely escaping his dry throat. The mother glanced back, and her heart skipped a beat. There were 5 or 6 figures sitting in the dimly lit back seats, but none of them moved. Not a single twitch, not even the rise and fall of their breathing. The air around them felt colder, almost too cold for a regular bus ride. She turned back to her husband, her voice low and panicked. "We need to get off this bus, now." The father nodded, clearly feeling the same icy dread that was creeping into their bones. He stood up, gripping the handrail as the bus swayed slightly on the winding road. "Excuse me," he called out to the driver, his voice shaky but firm. "Can we stop? We need to get off." The driver didn't respond. His hands, pale and stiff, gripped the wheel tightly, his face still obscured by the shadow of his cap. The father's frustration grew. "Hey, I said we need to get off." He moved closer to the front of the bus, reaching for the driver's shoulder. As his hand got close, he felt a chill emanating from the driver, colder than anything he'd ever felt. He recoiled, stepping back. The bus didn't slow down. In fact, it seemed to be moving faster, the scenery outside the fogged windows becoming a blur of dark shapes and twisted trees. It was as if the bus wasn't following the road anymore, but carving its own path through the night. Tom turned to look at the passengers again, and this time his breath caught in his throat. The figures had shifted. They were no longer sitting, but standing, their heads tilted unnaturally to one side, their bodies slightly translucent, as if fading in and out of existence. Their hollow eyes stared ahead, unblinking and lifeless. "Dad," Tom whispered, his voice breaking. They're not alive." The father looked back, his face draining of color. The passengers, those silent, unmoving figures, were no longer just passengers. They were something else, something not of this world. Their skin was pale, almost glowing, and their clothes were old, ragged, like they had been worn for centuries. Lily whimpered, burying her face in her mother's side. "Make it stop, please," she begged, tears welling up in her eyes. The mother held her close, trembling, her mind racing for an escape. But the bus seemed to have a mind of its own, speeding faster and faster through the fog, the road long forgotten behind them. Suddenly, the lights inside the bus flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the empty seats. The temperature dropped even further, frost creeping up the windows. A low, raspy whisper filled the air, echoing from the back of the bus, though no one could understand the words. It was as if the shadows themselves were speaking, their voices hollow and distant. "Where are we going?" the father shouted, his voice shaking with fear as he turned back toward the driver. Finally, the driver spoke, but his voice was barely human. It was cold, deep, and echoed like it came from a hollow place far away. "The final stop," he rasped. "You're all headed to the same place." The father's heart pounded as he pulled on the door handle, desperate to get out, but it wouldn't budge. The bus hurtled forward, the world outside twisting into shapes they no longer recognized, and the passengers, those ghostly figures, began moving toward them slowly, their steps unnaturally slow, but deliberate. Time was running out, and the bus showed no signs of stopping. Panic set in as the bus plunged deeper into an unknown darkness. The fog outside had thickened, swirling like a living entity, and the world beyond the windows became unrecognizable. The father yanked at the door handle again, but it remained locked, as if the bus itself refused to let them leave. Tom, still staring at the slowly advancing figures at the back, felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. "Mom, they're getting closer," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with terror. The ghostly passengers moved as if in a trance, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side, their eyes fixed on the family. The mother clutched Lily tightly, whispering calming words, though her own fear was palpable. She looked to her husband for answers, but he was as helpless as the rest of them. The family was trapped, and the atmosphere inside the bus had become suffocating. The cold seemed to penetrate their bones, and the air felt thick, heavy with an unshakable sense of doom. Tom's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He recalled something, a rumor he had overheard at school, about a bus that never reached its destination. People said it appeared on lonely roads at night, picking up travelers who were never seen again. They said the driver was a ghost, cursed to roam forever, gathering souls. Tom's hands shook as he leaned forward, voice trembling. "Mom, Dad, I've heard about this bus. This isn't some normal ride. It's the ghost bus. People who board, they don't come back." The words sent a chill through the group. The father glanced back at the approaching passengers, then to the driver, who sat eerily still. "That's just a story, Tom," he said, though his voice wavered. He didn't believe his own words, but Tom wasn't finished. He had noticed something odd. Reaching beneath his seat, he pulled out an old, tattered newspaper. It looked decades old, yellowed and worn. The headline sent a shiver down his spine. "Bus crash claims 17 lives. Driver vanishes without a trace." He held it up for everyone to see. This bus, it crashed years ago. The driver, he never made it out alive. The mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she read the article. It detailed a horrific accident on the same road they were traveling, where the bus had veered off a cliff, killing all aboard. The driver was never found, his body missing from the wreckage. Some said he had cursed the bus, forced to drive it for eternity, collecting the souls of the lost. Suddenly, the ghostly passengers began to murmur. It was a low, whispering sound that filled the bus, coming from every corner. Their voices echoed in the family's ears, though they spoke in a language no one could understand. The air grew colder, and frost started creeping up the windows, making it nearly impossible to see outside. "We have to get off this bus," the mother cried, her voice filled with terror. But the door remained locked, and the bus showed no sign of slowing down. The father, in a desperate attempt, lunged at the driver again, shaking him by the shoulder. "Stop the bus," he yelled. "Let us off." The driver turned slowly, and for the first time, the family saw his face, or rather, the absence of it. His cap fell back slightly, revealing nothing but darkness where his features should have been. His voice, hollow and inhuman, echoed through the bus. "There's no stopping now," he whispered, his words chilling the family to their core. "You're already on the final ride." The father stumbled backward, horrified by the sight. The bus roared forward, its speed increasing as the landscape outside twisted and warped into grotesque shapes. It was as if they were no longer on a road but plunging into some otherworldly abyss. The passengers, now fully revealed as ghosts, closed in on them. Their eyes, empty and soulless, stared right through the family as they moved with unnatural precision. The whispers grew louder, filling the bus with a deafening hum. Lily screamed, clinging to her mother, tears streaming down her face. The mother held her tight, but her own terror was overwhelming. The family was surrounded, and there was nowhere left to go. The bus jolted violently, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow. The father's breath hitched in his throat as he realized the truth. They were no longer alive. The bus wasn't just taking them to a place, it was taking them away from the world of the living. The realization hit them all at once. They were trapped on a ride they couldn't escape, heading toward a fate they couldn't avoid. The passengers, the driver, the bus, it was all part of a nightmare they had unknowingly boarded, and there was no turning back. As the bus sped through the twisted, nightmarish landscape, the family's desperation turned into raw panic. The father, breathing heavily, tried one last time to force the door open, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as though the bus itself was alive, refusing to let them escape. He banged on the door, shouting, "Let us out! We're not supposed to be here!" The ghostly passengers were now standing just a few feet away, their hollow eyes fixed on the family. The air around them was freezing, their presence sucking the warmth from the bus, leaving only a deep, bone-chilling cold. The whispers grew louder, filling the bus with an eerie, maddening hum that made it hard to think clearly. Tom's heart raced as he pulled at the window next to him, but it was sealed shut, frost crawling over the glass. "Dad, what do we do?" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the rising whispers. His eyes darted between the passengers and the driver, his fear spiraling out of control. The father turned to the driver one last time, determined to force an answer. "Why are you doing this? Where are you taking us?" His voice cracked with fear, but his determination hadn't faded. The driver remained motionless for a moment, before slowly turning his head. His face was still nothing but shadows and darkness, his hollow voice sending a chill through the family. "You boarded this bus. You've already crossed the line. There's no way back now." The father's hands trembled as the weight of the driver's words sank in. He took a step back, his legs shaking. "This can't be happening," he muttered under his breath, his mind scrambling for any possible way out. Suddenly, the mother stood up, clutching Lily tightly. "We need to break the windows," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's our only chance." Tom and the father nodded in agreement, their fear replaced by a desperate will to survive. They frantically searched the seats for something to use, but the bus seemed to have nothing that could help them. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, making the passengers' ghostly forms even more terrifying. The family huddled together, feeling the walls of the bus close in. Lily whimpered softly, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. The father grabbed hold of a metal bar near the window and started smashing it against the glass with all his strength. The sound echoed through the bus, sharp and desperate, but the window didn't break. No matter how hard the father struck, the glass remained intact, as if it was reinforced by some supernatural force. The ghostly passengers were now almost upon them, their pale hands outstretched, their lifeless faces filled with an eerie, silent intent. The whispers were deafening now, swirling all around them, drowning out their thoughts. Tom, shaking with fear, turned to his father. "It's not going to work. What are we going to do?" His voice cracked, tears of panic welling up in his eyes. The father, exhausted and trembling, dropped the metal bar and collapsed into the seat. He looked at his family, his face pale with terror. I don't know," he whispered, the words barely audible. The bus surged forward with a violent jolt, knocking them all back into their seats. The air grew colder, frost covering the walls and windows completely now, obscuring everything outside. It felt as if the bus was no longer moving through any recognizable place. It was headed somewhere far worse. Suddenly, the passengers were upon them. Their cold, ghostly hands reached out, brushing against the family's skin, sending waves of icy terror through them. Lily screamed as one of the figures touched her shoulder, its hand leaving a frosty print on her jacket. The mother held her close, eyes wide with fear, but she was powerless to stop them. The father, filled with a newfound resolve, jumped to his feet and tried to push the ghostly figures away, but his hands went right through them as if they were made of smoke. He screamed in frustration, helpless against the supernatural forces that now surrounded them. Tom stood frozen, watching in horror as the passengers closed in on them. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of their fate settling in. There was no escape, no way out. The whispers grew louder and louder, the air so cold now that their breaths came out in visible puffs of white mist. The driver spoke once more, his voice echoing through the bus, final and cold. "This is your stop." The bus screeched to a halt, and the door creaked open. But outside there was no road, no town, no safety, just a swirling void of darkness. The ghostly figures moved faster now, closing in on the family from all sides. The family screamed as the cold hands pulled them toward the open door, toward the endless abyss waiting outside. And then, with a final chilling whisper, the bus plunged into the void. The bus had come to a complete stop, its doors wide open, revealing nothing but a swirling, pitch-black void outside. The thick fog that had surrounded them moments ago had vanished, leaving only a dark emptiness that seemed to stretch out forever. The bus, once creaking and groaning, now sat in dead silence, as though even it were afraid of the darkness beyond. The father, clutching the seat in front of him, was frozen with terror. He looked back at his family, his wife gripping their daughter tightly, and Tom staring wide-eyed at the door. Their faces reflected the same hopeless fear that had settled deep inside him. There was no more road, no more safety, only the abyss. The ghostly passengers, now fully materialized, were close enough to touch. Their pale, almost transparent forms hovered silently around the family, their hollow eyes fixed on them with eerie stillness. The cold air grew even more frigid, and the mother could barely speak through her chattering teeth as she whispered, "We can't go out there, we can't." But the father knew they were out of time. The darkness beyond the door called to them, pulling them closer. The whispers that had echoed throughout the bus had become one loud, continuous hum, pressing against their minds, suffocating them in its malevolent presence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the driver turned his head toward them, finally breaking his stillness. His face remained hidden in the shadows of his cap, but his voice, cold, empty, and final, cut through the tension like a blade. "It's time." The father stood, his legs shaky, and stepped forward, shielding his family from the ghosts. "You're not taking them," he shouted, his voice cracking, though he knew it was futile. His hands trembled as he reached for the door, but the pull of the void was stronger now, tugging at his very soul. Without warning, one of the ghostly passengers lunged forward, its icy hand brushing against the mother's arm. She screamed, pulling Lily closer, but the touch was too strong. The chill spread through her body like a wave, freezing her in place. Tom leapt toward his mother, trying to pull her away, but his hands passed right through the ghost as though it were nothing but air. The whispers turned into screams, shrill, deafening, and filled with anguish. The ghosts moved faster now, their hollow eyes filled with hunger, as they began to pull at the family. One by one, their hands wrapped around the father, the mother, Tom, and Lily, dragging them toward the open door. The father fought against them with all his strength, but the cold had sapped his energy. His limbs felt heavy, numb, his vision blurred as the darkness beyond the door grew closer, swallowing the light around him. He could hear his family's terrified cries, but they seemed distant, as though they were being pulled into another world. "No," he shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. He reached out, trying to grab hold of something, anything, but his hands only grasped at the empty air. The void was pulling them all in, its cold, endless blackness devouring them piece by piece. Lily's screams echoed through the bus as she was pulled from her mother's arms, her tiny hand reaching out in a final, desperate attempt to hold on. But the void had her now. The mother's cries were cut off as she too was dragged into the darkness, followed by Tom, his eyes wide with terror as he disappeared into the abyss. The father, barely able to stand, was the last. He felt the cold, ghostly hands on his shoulders, pulling him toward the door. The driver turned to him one final time, his shadowed face revealing nothing but a void of its own. With a whisper that chilled him to his core, the driver spoke. "This is your stop." The father's vision faded as the cold consumed him. The last thing he saw was the black, swirling void beyond the door. And then, nothing. The bus, now empty, sat in silence once more. The ghostly passengers faded back into their seats, their hollow eyes returning to their endless watch. The driver, faceless and still, turned the wheel and the bus rumbled to life. The door creaked shut and the bus rolled forward, disappearing into the fog once again, leaving only silence in its wake. Some say if you find yourself on a foggy road late at night, you might hear the faint hum of a bus engine approaching. But beware, once you board the ghostly bus, there's no turning back. The road ahead always leads to darkness. The bus vanished into the fog, its eerie presence fading from sight, but the terror it left behind would forever linger. The road was empty now, as if nothing had ever happened, as if the family had never existed. The night resumed its unnatural quiet, the thick mist swirling across the road like a restless ghost, hiding the dark secrets of what had just unfolded. Time passed, and the world outside continued without notice. No one knew the family was gone. Their home would remain untouched, their lives erased from the memories of those who once knew them. To the world, they had simply vanished. But the bus, cursed to travel between the realms of the living and the dead, continued its journey. It never stopped for long, always moving through the fog, appearing when least expected. The driver, faceless and emotionless, guided the bus toward its next passengers, those who, like the family, would soon learn that once you board, you are bound to the ride forever. The ghostly passengers, forever trapped in their silent torment, waited in the shadows of the back seats. Their eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, stared forward, their expressions frozen in eternal fear. They were the lost souls, doomed to relive the same journey over and over again, never finding peace, always waiting for the next group of travelers to join them. And so, the legend of the ghostly driver grew. Whispers of the cursed bus spread through small towns and among late-night travelers. People spoke of strange disappearances along desolate roads, of families and friends who never made it home. They warned each other not to drive on foggy nights, not to board a bus that seemed out of place, because once you stepped aboard, you were already too far gone. In the end, no one could escape the driver's final destination. The bus continued its journey through the foggy night, unseen but always present, waiting for its next passengers, bound for an eternal ride into the darkness. Its headlights glowed dimly, the sound of its engine barely audible as it drifted through the desolate roads, ever searching, ever moving. The road ahead was endless, the final stop forever unknown.